For the past few years, the news has been filled with stories of book bans. According to PEN America, there have been nearly 16,000 book bans in public schools nationwide since 2021, a number not seen since the Red Scare McCarthy era of the 1950s. In the 2023 to 2024 school year, a greater percentage of these books were completely removed from district library collections. These book removals are driven by activist parents who believe their kids shouldn't be exposed to certain topics. Targeted books often involve LGBTQ issues, sexuality, and unpleasant episodes in US and world history. Many of these book removals start in the school library, where they are more politically palatable, since arguably the materials can still be accessed at a public library or a bookstore. However, would-be book censors often don't stop there. Once successful in the schools, they set their sights on new targets, such as age-based restrictions at the public library. While not all of these events rise to the level of a full ban, they do represent an attempt to censor what books young people can access. And I want to say, I get it. I understand why some parents might want to oversee the books their kids read. To demonstrate why, I wanted to share my story. The way I grew up contributed to my potentially controversial views around book censorship. It all started when I was a kid. I began reading when I was 3 years old. My parents would read beginner books to me out loud, holding them up so I could follow along to the words in the pictures. One night, my dad was reading me a story, and I suddenly realized that I knew what the printed words meant. I remember feeling a sense of excitement and power as I understood I no longer needed his help to decipher the words on the page. I soon started reading chapter books. By the time I entered school, I was reading far above grade level. Throughout my primary so-called education, the school system never really was able to keep up. I was often effectively punished for being more advanced than my grade level, but that's another topic for another day. I loved learning on my own by reading books. I was lucky that my parents took me to the public library quite frequently. I got my own library card in kindergarten, and I still have that first library card ever with my name messily scrawled on the back. To me, it's a treasured possession symbolizing freedom and exploration, and it is a fond reminder of all the books I enjoyed in my youth. At first, my parents attempted to read every book I brought home so they could discuss them with me, but soon they gave up. They were pretty busy, and I just read so many books. And in a parenting move that I now greatly appreciate, they did not attempt to interfere with my reading life. My curiosity was insatiable. I loved reading everything from encyclopedias to histories and biographies. I also especially loved fiction. While I did read novels intended for children, I gravitated toward adult books. I remember the day I took one of my dad's books down from the shelf. The adult novels looked so intimidating, with their small font and the author name always bigger than the title. But when I opened this book, I soon discovered that the words it contained were no more difficult than those in the kids' books. This was another thrilling moment in my reading journey when I realized that I could read any book that was out there. In middle school, my favorite author quickly became James Michener, and I read most of his work. This was around the time when things started to get interesting in my reading life. Parents who were less permissive than mine might have started to become concerned because, as you can imagine, I started to discover what some people might consider to be mature content. I distinctly remember reading some novel, I don't recall the title, for a 5th grade book report that contained lots of sex and violence. And I was definitely shocked, and I remember wondering how I was going to sanitize the contents for my presentation to my classmates. I found that book upsetting, but it wasn't nearly as bad as what I would encounter in high school. In high school was when I got to the really disturbing stuff. Somehow I fell down a rabbit hole of reading about World War II, specifically the horrific crimes that Nazis committed in concentration camps. It's not that kids' books don't deal with this. Lois Lowry wrote about the Holocaust in her children's book Number the Stars, but that book doesn't necessarily get into the details. At the time, as a sheltered 14-year-old living a fairly privileged middle-class existence in a small town, my worldview was shattered by what I read. It was the first time that I learned that people within living memory in a country seemingly not too different from ours did unimaginably evil things. And not just haphazard or accidental evil, but in an organized, committed way. That was when some people might think things really started to go off the rails for me. This is what started me on my path toward atheism. I grew up in a religious family. Christianity was a huge part of my family's heritage. Several family members were pastors pastors, including my grandfather. We attended church every Sunday, and we didn't just attend, we were active. I was in the church music program, which meant that I wasn't just there on Sundays, I was there other days of the week as well for rehearsal and practice. As a kid, I was very serious about my relationship with God, but when I learned about the things that happened in World War II, I started to question my beliefs. It didn't seem right that God could sit idly by while allowing such horrific things to happen, even if there was the concept of free will. In some ways, it seemed perverse to believe in a God that did just sit there while allowing humans to torture and slaughter each other in the worst ways imaginable, all just to test them on whether they deserved to go to heaven or not. There were other, less traumatizing ways in which reading freely also led me to question the beliefs I grew up with. One book series I loved at the local library was called Culture Shock. It was a travel nonfiction series about what Americans should expect to encounter when living in other countries. I really enjoyed learning about different cultural traditions, some which had quite different worldviews than my own. One thing I started to wonder was, how is it possible that out of all the different groups of people and religions in the world, only Christians are right? And what makes Christians so sure they're right when not only are there currently competing religions, but there have been vastly different beliefs all throughout history, many of them predating Jesus himself. While questioning the assumptions I grew up with was difficult at times, I wouldn't have it any other way. Reading without censorship or restriction made me feel invested in learning as much as I could about the world. It gave me a feeling of agency in directing my education, finding information, and forming my own views. It gave me a sense of humility as I was constantly confronted by how little I really knew. It created a lifelong drive to keep learning. It led me to develop opinions that were sometimes unpopular in my family, my community, or even in my country, but that I believe brought me closer to understanding the world we live in. It taught me to love the life of the mind and the pursuit of truth. So I do understand why some parents might want to control what their kids read. If my parents had stopped me from reading certain books, perhaps I wouldn't be the monster I am today. A person who continually learns new things, reevaluates my beliefs, and is open to questioning the assumptions of the society in which I live. Reading books undoubtedly led me to certain beliefs and interests which many people do consider undesirable, such as atheism and feminism. But my parents' decision to allow me to read was the ultimate sign of respect. It showed that they trusted me to become my own person, even if the result wasn't necessarily what they anticipated. It has become apparent in this era of United States history that while our culture pays lip service to individual freedom, there is a significant portion of the population who prefer authoritarianism. They want to control what information people can access in an effort to censor the past and shape the future. They don't want people to encounter ideas that could lead them to question the prevailing order, whether it's the majority religion, our economic system, our social hierarchies, or the destruction and ecocide of our planet by industrialized capitalism. Many parents want their kids to be little clones of themselves, to believe the same things, act in the same way, and follow the same life path laid out by tradition. The thought of books leading those kids astray is scary. The thought of a kid learning something their parents don't know is scary. And apparently, the thought of kids developing empathy for people who are different from them is scary. Especially if you're Allie Beth Stuckey and you think everyone should only have empathy for people who are exactly like you. I would argue that while these things may seem frightening, giving kids the freedom to read is worth it. It allows them to develop intellectual curiosity, become more fully engaged with the world, and develop a greater sense of agency in determining their own path. This is something we must honor if we truly value individual freedom, because the irony of these attempts at censorship is that all Americans are guaranteed freedom of speech in the First Amendment without age restrictions, which I believe necessarily implies that we must also have freedom of information. Removing books from libraries so kids can't read them is the antithesis of the individual freedom that is supposed to be our birthright. Here is the potentially controversial section of my rant. While even some of the would-be censors say that adults should have access to the books in question, I believe children also deserve the freedom to read absolutely whatever they want. Speaking of the F word, feminism, while I don't agree with everything Shulamith Firestone says about the raising of children, I think she's right that the modern creation of artificial distinctions between kids and adults and the segregation of kids into age-based grades in school stunts children's growth and is indeed a form of oppression. We chronically underestimate what kids can handle, attempting to preserve a myth of innocence that I believe does young people a serious disservice. Reading books at a young age, including books that sometimes upset me, was an essential part of my intellectual and personal development. I couldn't have done it with a parent or teacher looming over my shoulder dictating what was supposedly age appropriate. And I can't imagine how stifling it would have been to have a parent dictate that I read only wholesome books that promoted a falsely rosy view of the world, as in this so-called good books list created by a parent group in Utah. It would have taken all the fun out of reading. It would have been even more infuriating if it were not my family, but someone else's prudish parents who determined what books I could access in the library. Because that's what these people are doing. They're scared their own kid is going to read something they don't like, so they take it upon themselves to make that decision for everyone. Sounds like some real individual freedom right there, especially in an era when kids are exposed to so much low quality and attention-degrading information via social media and the internet. It's arguably even more important for them to engage freely with books, which, dare I say, tend to be higher quality than TikToks. And I believe the significant challenges we face in this country often originate in a population that does not have adequate access or engagement with high-quality information. The best way to combat misinformation, prejudice, propaganda, lack of curiosity, general ignorance, and plain old bad taste is to encourage kids to learn to think deeply by reading lots and lots of books. Here's an added bonus and a secret for parents who do want their kids to read. When they can choose whatever they want, reading becomes a lot more fun. I say, let them read. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.